I'm very much following in the footsteps of Rick, who started off by researching fast boats and then moved on to fast cars, and he'll be telling you in a moment what he's up to at the moment. My area is much more tame, and partly it's driven by the idea of the creative industries. And one of the things that drives that area is the assumption that within areas such as music, drama, art, and so on, that you could be far more productive if you were to learn from other established industries and become more businesslike in what you're doing. And the research is actually taking a slightly different angle on that, to look at what is going on, what is seen to be effective practice, what becomes replicated and what becomes enlarged, and see if learning can operate not just in a unidirectional way, but in multi-directions, as Sandra was suggesting earlier. Now, I'll focus mainly on the question of where practices come from, and that will then be elaborated a little more by Rick in a moment. But just as an example, I want to take an idea from Davide Niccolini, who talks about zooming in and zooming out. And I think that's quite a useful phrase for us to use, because some practices, in a sense, are very large. They're routines, they're normal ways of doing things, they become codified. So in Sandra's example, drawing from medicine, there's lots of codification of the way that you would do certain things. Martha Feldman, for example, has looked at recruitment strategies and the way you would do recruitment. So those are kind of zoom out, big scale practices. But in reality, for most of us in the day-to-day version of that, the way that we do a particular interview or recruit a particular person or ask a particular question during an interview bears some relation to that big practice, but not complete. And in other words, practices often come from trying to replicate the big examples, but also they then become adapted, changed, improvised in the moment when we're trying to enact them. And the argument for where practices come from is really the dialogue between those two things. Big practices giving us some patterns to follow, and then following them either imperfectly or deliberately improvising around them, and therefore creating new approaches. Now, in the creative industries, rather than using just the terms big and small or the various terminology that's used, one way of looking at that is to talk about genres and performance. So a genre is a stylistic mode in which there are a set of rules that you follow, and I've picked a few that I would guess would be fairly familiar to the audience. So these are modes of music from urban, metal, and pop, and they're quite different sorts of performance. People dress differently, people play at different volumes, they use different instruments, but there's a set of rules within each of these that is fairly well bounded. But if you look at that from a production or a marketing point of view, you therefore might look at the circles with the fairly strong red lines around them as we've got there. So particular producers work in one of these genres, but not typically across them very much. You market within one of the genres and not across them very much. But if you zoom in a little bit, then you often find that the way that musicians think about it is much more micro. They'll have small dots in the diagram of other musicians that they relate to and that they learn from and often play with. And so there's a different sort of focus in the way that they work. However, if you zoom out again and take a musical perspective, then actually you could say that although those genres look very different in one way, they look very similar in others. So typically they're playing at an allegro speed. You don't see a huge amount of variance across those different genres. Very typically they're playing in a major key. Very typically they use a lot of perfect cadence and so on. So actually, depending on where you focus, there's either a lot of difference or very little. And the advantage of thinking at those two levels and moving between them is that those are sometimes the places that we can start to challenge ourselves and challenge others and work towards some of the collaborative learning that Sandra was talking about. As a very brief example, I just want to talk quickly about some of the empirical work that's going on at the moment. And this is a story of a group of people coming together to write an album. It's not in any of the genres that I've just talked about it, quite deliberately. I'm not going to name the album or the artists. But this was a process whereby 9 people who were all singer-songwriters, in effect, came together in a house that had been rented for the purpose to spend a week together composing. And the first thing that they did was have a group meeting in which they tore up the spreadsheet that had come from the management. And the spreadsheet was the thing that was, in a sense, an organizing practice, a big-scale thing that says, well, we need so many songs out of this, and we need a length like this, and really trying to enable people to be very productive in the week. But they saw it as being very controlling. So the first thing they did was to tear it up. And what they then did was to split off into pairs and spend time with each other, composing and writing and thinking about it, and then just hanging out and doing a fair amount of playing to each other and drinking and so on. And then the next day they would change the pairing and work in different setups. And they were very happy that what came out of it actually turned out to be a very coherent album, which has actually done very well and sold very effectively. So that's one version of the story. But of course, reality, as we know, isn't one story. There are 2, 3, 4 different versions of that. So if you go and speak to the managers, then actually they don't know of any spreadsheet. They're not aware of that. That's not part of their story at all. And yet for the musicians, a really important thing was that they'd torn up something that from another perspective doesn't even exist. If you look at the way that they've then torn up management and not being confined, what they've then done is actually a very classical form of development of ideas and products. So they've gone through a process of pairing off, working through a process, then in the night time when they were hanging out together, playing what they've done to each other, getting feedback, and then reworking it in, as a result of those reviews. And therefore you can construct what they've done as they did as being almost anti-management practice. And then look again at what they've done and say, well, in another sense, what you've done is a really nice piece of product development that was highly organized, highly communal, and highly effective. So there's a range of other things that I could say about that, but I won't at the moment, other than to say, in a sense, what was really important to them was that although they were working within a big genre, and there's lots of examples of people working in that way, of going away, isolating themselves, composing, that's happened for centuries. What they felt was that they had invented this themselves, and by tearing up the spreadsheet had done something that was genuinely innovative, that in a sense gave them freedom to reinvent the practice for themselves. And that might not be wasted time. Even though it seems to be a reinvention of the wheel, in a sense, that also enabled them to do something different in that particular context.
Thank you